Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Simon Ricketts. I'm a partner at Town Legal, and I'm going to chair this session today, which is hosted by ourselves at Town Legal and with Francis Taylor Building. So welcome to this discussion as to whether there's a case for expanding the Planning Act 2008 development consent order process to cover strategic scale residential-led projects. This is the process where, of course, decisions on nationally significant infrastructure projects are taken by government to a generally fixed timescale and gathering together a number of necessary authorisations in the same consenting package. It's been possible since December 2013 for business and commercial projects. Why not the delivery of housing? Or has that NSHIP sailed? We're here to find out at this crucial time of public debate as to the future for our planning system. I'm joined by a brilliant panel to help us through the issues. And panel, I'm going to ask you individually to say hello or wave by way of introduction, and I hope everyone can see you all by way of the gallery function. I'm joined first of all by leading planning and infrastructure planning barrister Michael Humphries QC from Francis Taylor Building. Hi, Michael. John Rhodes, founder of planning consultancy Quod. John was centrally involved back almost 10 years ago with the gestation of what is now the National Planning Policy Framework, and a familiar face at many NSHIP examinations. Hello, John.
Hi, everybody.
Another planner, Kathryn Ventham, partner at Barton, Willmore. Kathryn has experience which is second to none in relation to major residential development and local plan processes around the country under our current 1990 Act system. Her firm is another familiar participant in the NSHIP world and is shortly to publish a research paper on our specific topic today.
Hello.
Hi, Kathryn. A third planner, Gordon Adams, nowadays head of planning at and public affairs at Battersea Power Station, because this shouldn't just be a debate about new settlements and urban extensions, but about significant urban development as well. And before Battersea, Gordon, of course, your experience was as a planning officer at a London borough. And I'll also look forward to hearing your insights as to the investor's perspective. Hi, Gordon. Last but not least, Bridget Rosewell, a commissioner with the National Infrastructure Commission, author of a eponymous report into the inquiry appeals system, and someone who seems to have the ear of government more than the rest of us. So to begin with, a few housekeeping points to note. Your microphones, delegates, are automatically muted, so you won't need to adjust your local settings. We very much welcome questions throughout the system. Please submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible during the event. The event is being recorded and you'll receive a link to the recording shortly after the event concludes if I press the right buttons. If your connection is lost at any point during the webinar, do join the meeting again by clicking on the original link. So before I turn to the panel, can I start by trying to define the problem, and indeed, is there a problem? Well, the Secretary of State, Robert Jenrick, defines the problem in his March Planning for the Future document. The planning system is now complex, out of date, and fails to deliver enough homes where they're needed. And it seems to me it must be right that we're not providing enough homes in the right places for the people that need them, whether to rent or buy. There are many causes for that. Would be wrong to blame the infrastructure of our planning system alone, but it's clear that it can be made to work better, more quickly, and in a more joined up way in terms of the provision of infrastructure. So we know that the government plans an ambitious planning white paper to modernise the system, to ensure it supports delivery of homes that local people need, creating beautiful and greener communities. We know from the Prime Minister's statement last week that we expect a planning policy paper this month to set out the plan for a comprehensive reform of the planning system to, quote, introduce an approach that works better for our modern economy and society. So will this be alongside Rishi Sunak's emergency summer budget tomorrow, probably too early, or perhaps on or around the 20th of July ahead of the summer recess? Well, who knows? But you know, fundamentally, seems to me we do have a problem. But I wanted to start with, you know, asking that question to Kathryn, with your experience, Kathryn. You know, why has the planning system found it so hard to deliver large-scale housing development? And before you answer that, you might want to just say something about the research that I mentioned earlier that Barton Willmore shortly to publish.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, this is a topic I could talk on for hours, but obviously I won't. Just as a sort of precursor, really. Yeah, so we have a research report which has been led by my colleagues Ben Lewis and Tom Carpen, and that research report is done. It was done in parallel with Copper Consulting and Womble Dickinson, and it looks at this exact topic. Basically, it looks at whether or not development consent orders can assist in meeting the challenges of our time. So it's engaged with practitioners. I think Michael's been involved, Bridget's been involved. And what that's done is it's looked across public and private sector backgrounds and basically had a look at what makes the DCO process a success for the projects it handles, and whether or not the DCO process in its current form is suitable to be adapted in some way to basically deal with the problem that's arising in terms of the delivery of new settlements. So that report is going to be published tomorrow, and there's a number of recommendations. It's a first phase report. It will then go on to sort of take those recommendations forward into a second phase as well. But in terms of where the problem lies with the current system, the problem with part of the problem with the current system is actually dealing with housing need. There's masses of rhetoric on the fact that at a national level there is a huge housing need, you know, and I think everybody across all political parties buys into that. The problem is translating that down from a national level to then a regional level to then a local level. And I think even at a regional level there's an acceptance of the housing need. The problem is that at the moment all the power for that is dealt with locally, and that's where the problem falls down. It's part of the government's agenda, localism. Everything's decided locally, which sounds very great, but it's an awful lot of responsibility, and it's a very political matter as well. And so actually, it's a bit like a giant game of pass the parcel. You know, who's actually going to deliver the housing need? So that's one of the problems, is actually settling on what the actual housing need is and the willingness to deliver that. You've then got the issue of actually local plan promotion itself. It's extremely time consuming. It's becoming more and more expensive, and it's just becoming very, very cumbersome. The amount of information you now need to get large scale sites through the system is just racking up, and at the backdrop of that, really, you've still got the political uncertainty. You don't know whether the plan's going to be stopped and started and taken in another direction, and there's a huge amount of upfront investment that has to go in before you've got any certainty whatsoever that your site is going to be delivered. And then you know, within that, you've got issues such as CPO, etc., and actually how many landowners control the land, how do you deal with equalisation, etc. I mean, certainly at the moment, the first question that we're being asked for, or that I'm being asked for any big sites that we put forward, is how many landowners are there? How much control do you have over it? And it's all linked back to this deliverability point. And that's all kind of set in the context, really, of sort of no overarching national policy, national strategies to how we're going to really deliver the amount of housing we need. And this will become, we'll end up talking about this, I suspect, a number of times as we go through this, but this has manifested itself in the problem that we see in North Essex. authorities which have been amazingly pro-growth. They've been so proactive in terms of proposals put forward to deliver somewhere in the region of 43,000 new homes. But actually the bar for getting those sites away has been set so high that 2 of them haven't actually got through. And so you've sort of got a really difficult situation where you've got authorities which are so proactive in it, and actually they've not been able to get those schemes over the bar. And now you look at the conclusions of those reports and you think, well, actually, how is anybody really going to bring large-scale sites through if actually if the tests that are in there are the tests that you've all got to meet? It's going to be nearly impossible.
John, did you want to make a comment about North Essex?
Just to say that I had a very helpful conversation with Ian Vipond, a Colchester borough planner responsible for promoting the strategy in the Colchester plan. And as Kathryn said, very frustrated because there's an authority really trying to do what the government wants them to do, being very proactive, recognising the benefit of planning on a large scale, try and capture value invested in infrastructure and affordable housing, but coming up against this deliverability test, which is writ large in the requirements for a local plan, and so hard to demonstrate that deliverability test, ironically, particularly if you don't have DCO powers. So land assembly, funding of infrastructure, consenting of infrastructure, demonstrating that all of those can come together and be delivered is the test required for a local plan. But promoters of land are very unlikely to have those in place until the local plan itself is in place. There's a kind of chicken and egg. There's an inherent problem within the local plan process. And DCO powers, as we'll come on to discuss, would help you break out of that. But I think government, local authorities and promoters are now increasingly concerned that the local plan process may not deliver housing on a large scale. And that means that they default to planning on a smaller scale, because if you put a large site in your plan, the whole plan falls over if the site falls over. So you'll see local plans defaulting to a kind of safety first, less proactive planning.
Yeah. So we've obviously got a limited ability at the moment to include housing within DCOs, where it's sort of related to the infrastructure project. We've had that since April 2017. I just, it doesn't seem to have been taken up a great deal as an opportunity. I don't know, John, whether you have any views on that from your perspective of advising sort of infrastructure promoters.
Yeah, thank you. I thought it was interesting that the government introduced the reform. It did at least recognise the principle that housing can be handled through this DCO process, but it did so in a very cautious way, and it only allows for up to 500 dwellings where there is either a functional relationship with the infrastructure or there's immediate physical proximity. It kind of addresses the wrong problem. It's not so much that infrastructure promoters want housing as part of their scheme. There's very little infrastructure that generates housing requirements, apart perhaps from construction worker housing, which, as we know from the Hinckley case, isn't actually housing and can already be consented through the DCO process. But if infrastructure on a large scale was going to generate housing, it would generate large scale housing, like a major infrastructure corridor, for instance. So to limit the ability to 500 homes was kind of not really a useful reform. It was, the principle was nice, but what we really need is a DCO process which allows housing projects that may need infrastructure rather than the other way around.
Michael, did you have any thoughts on the limitations of that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as John has explained, the 2016 Act, Housing and Planning Act 2016 amendments to section 115 of the Act were very limited. This sort of functional test, locality test, and the number of dwellings, which meant that it was never going to be, it could never be residential led. And so, when I'm advising promoters of DCOs, they're typically statutory undertakers, regulated companies of one sort or another, National Grid, Highways England, Network Rail, people of that sort. And if you say to them, well, look, hang on, we could put in 500 dwellings, they would look, you know, absolutely amazed at me. And the reason for that is that housing's controversial. I mean, there's no getting away from that. Housing is very controversial. And for utility companies of one sort or another trying to deliver infrastructure, anything which is controversial, which is a risk to consent, is also a risk to program. And they're just not going to be very interested in that. So if the question is Section 115, related housing development, the answer to the problem, the answer to that is no.
Right, let's get rid of that one. No, not to get rid of it, but we'll park that. But Bridget, what are we looking for? You know, what are the components of a process that might work, that might deliver?
Okay, so I think, so first of all, we've got to decide what problem we're trying to solve here. So is this about new settlements, which will necessarily have associated infrastructure with them? I absolutely agree with Michael that if we're talking about putting a bit of housing on the side of something which is a separate need for infrastructure, which isn't related to that, then, yeah, as you say, let's park that. So we might have the need for significant scale housing development, but which is nonetheless doesn't require a lot of land assembly or a lot of associated infrastructure, doesn't require any CPO powers. That might be quite suitable for a local development order, for example, and we maybe should think about whether there should be more use of those. And that comes back, I think, importantly to some of the things Kathryn was talking about the local plan process itself. I'm very interested in what John said about the North Essex thing is going to make local plans even more safety first. So if we could have a DCO process which enabled those infrastructure pieces to come together with the housing pieces, that would be a really good thing. My challenge to that idea is then the kind of ways that the DCO process itself works. And I think that's the bit that we really need to talk about a lot more, because some of the people that I've been talking to about their DCO processes is they've become incredibly detailed and incredibly detailed in the kind of things you then have to consult upon, which later on you come back to try and deliver it and you suddenly discover you can't quite do it like that because of a ground condition or whatever, or the world has changed a bit as it keeps doing. Oh, your DCO isn't valid anymore. Now what are you going to do? And you have to go through the whole process all over again. And if you think about this as a solution to the North Essex challenge, the whole problem was that they couldn't show a viability over the kind of time frame which it takes to develop a community, which is probably a generation. It's at least 30 years, it may be longer. How are you going to have a DCO process, and what are the criteria that you would need to put into a DCO process which would make it possible for you to show, deliver, to plan that and to deliver that and to have a DCO permission which is appropriate over that kind of time scale. And so I am very interested in how we could take the DCO process and make it suitable for new settlements, but maybe even then it won't work, and the only way that will is a development corporation, which is after all another kind of tool in the toolbox, and maybe that's the only thing that you could do which would enable you to deliver that new settlement with its associated infrastructure and the associated CPO requirements that you might well have in order to make that happen. Then we'll come to the finance problem, but I'll leave it at the moment.
Okay, that's fascinating. And when you were talking about the way in which, you know, the needs of a project change over time and the long build out, I was thinking of Gordon and Battersea Power Station, and it'd be really interesting to hear your reflections on, from a sort of London opportunity area perspective, of the challenges of the current system with its processes and activities.
Thank you, Simon. And it's been wonderful listening to everyone. And I kind of think, well, what I'm going to say, and then I go, oh, that's a good point. But I think a common thing that's actually running through all of this, and actually was also part of the zoning discussion that you hosted recently, is this complexity point that Kathryn mentioned. And that's certainly something that we've been. It's been a long time since I've been involved in a local plan inquiry, but certainly through what we do at the power station in managing our process through the system, there has been, I've certainly observed what I call mission creep, and that more things coming into the system and moving away from what my old boss at Southwark used to call saying, you know, I remember when it used to be land use and appearance, whereas planning has become so much more. And you know, that kind of, I can remember someone mentioned about the plan being too prescriptive and too perfect. And I remember Renzo Piano in his cross-examination for the Shard was asked about, you know, surely you should wait till there's a tall buildings policy for your building. And he said, well, I think you can become paralyzed by perfection. I quite like that. And if I could be a bit controversial, I sort of, you know, colloquially group policy planners as utopians and development management planners as pragmatists. And I just find in what I've experienced, which I'll come on to, is it's a lot harder being a pragmatist these days in the system that we've got. But in terms of opportunity areas and my experience, there's the experience of Battersea Power Station as a 42-acre master plan, but also sitting within the VNEB OA, Vauxhall 9 Elms Battersea Opportunity Area, and which is, you know, a significant area that crosses both Wandsworth and Lambeth, so with two different local boroughs. And I think, just as a general point, if delivery is the measure, it's actually worked quite well. There is, having gone from vacant industrial land, there are now thousands of homes built. There is the new US Embassy, the tube lines being built, power stations being restored, as in, you know, there's a lot going on. But breaking it down into two very basic experiences I've observed is that the system worked quite well in the early stages, in the early planning. There was an OAPF that was the light planning framework. There was a lot of collaboration, and you know, it was hard work, but everyone had a part to play, and it all came together. However, the delivery point, trying to deliver something over, and what Bridget referred to, the long period, certainly trying to explain all this to our sort of international shareholders has been a challenge, because, you know, it's a 10 million square foot scheme, but it's now also 10 years old. And we've lodged over 500 planning applications in just under 8 years, been to planning committee 15 times. DOVs, we're on DOV 10 at the moment of our section 106. And that's where the problems have arisen, is managing that through the existing process, and putting in systems like section 96A and section 73 sort of have helped, but they've also narrowed the discussion. And it's almost like we are successful despite the system, but that's because we've got a good team. We've got a good team with Wandsworth, and we work really hard to make it work. But a lot of the times, when we're debating things, you kind of sit back and think, you know, what are we delivering? Because we're so focused on process and detail and bureaucracy that you kind of forget that you're actually trying to deliver these great places.
So you need a process that delivers an element of pragmatism and flexibility, but presumably accords with a vision that has to be set out, and some, you know, strategic assessment and direction at the outset. And
yeah,
as you know, Michael, I suppose for us as lawyers, the challenge is always, you know, having a process that avoids challenge, that delivers on, you know, legal requirements in terms of environmental assessments, etc. I mean, how do you see the requirements of a functioning system?
Yeah, I mean, it's a genuine issue. I mean, obviously the 2008 Act system has been in existence for some time. It's pretty robust. There have been challenges. There's only been one successful challenge to a DCO. This is not a sort of a system that has been found wanting in that respect. I think where legal challenge, though, and legal risk becomes important is particularly in the idea of, you know, who are we granting these powers to? As I said before, you know, most of the infrastructure providers are utility companies or, in any event, regulated companies. But that's very different if you move into the field where actually the people granted these legal powers in a statutory instrument, you know, a DCO, are actually private housing developers. And you will get, I think, questions from people, you know, questioning the legitimacy of that. Should they have these powers? Should they have these particular powers in perpetuity? Do you need to introduce sunset clauses into powers so that at a certain point the powers fall away and local authorities take over the running of, you know, roads and other things? So it seems to me that those are things that are capable of being resolved. They're the sort of things on which government might include guidance as to what is appropriate for a housing DCO or a housing-led DCO, as opposed to, say, you know, a power station or a widening of a motorway. But they are nevertheless things that need to be appropriately tackled. And that's partly touches on an issue that maybe we'll come back to later on, you know, issues around democratic deficit and those sort of things. But I think, you know, essentially the system is a stable, a robust one. But I think the detail is still important.
And we've had a question about, you know, whether we should be looking at, you know, the New Towns Act, and it feeds into what Bridget was saying about development corporations. But it seems to me there's a number of potential, you know, routes for major development here. And is,
yeah.
You know,
well, I mean, Bridget may mention this, but obviously, you know, at the end of last year, we had the big consultation on the reform of development corporations and whether that should be expanded. And you know, Bridget, you probably want to comment on that, because I know you're a great, perhaps wrong to say champion, but you're very interested in the idea of development corporations and what they can do.
Well, absolutely. And I think that is, I'm beginning to think that is a longer term route. You can put a geography on it. The development corporation can have the right kind of powers. It can be long lived, but also have an end point. And I think that's the difference between the New Towns Act, which I think is, it took a long while to sort of bring them to stop them being new towns, if you like, and get that transition right. And indeed, I'm not sure it has worked terribly well in all cases. So that's the way I've been thinking that you could take this forward, but you could also have as a partner in your development corporation the local authority. So if we go back to, if you like, what we're calling the North Essex problem, is a development corporation a good route to take those garden communities, the partnership between local authority and the landowner, and say, you know, you can now use that as a mechanism yourselves, instead of it's not being put down on top of you, because I think it's that partnership aspect which is actually really important for generating something which is acceptable to people who are already there, as well as enabling the growth. I mean, what the fundamental problem we're all trying to grapple with here is getting that balance, which is what planning is all, in my view. If it's about anything, it's about creating that balance between the interests of people who are already there, the interests of people who ought to be there, and the bigger, if you like, national public, more general public interest for you know, solving the housing crisis and getting away from, well, not in my backyard problem. And again, development corporations with that kind of with a powers, but also linked back to local communities, seem to me to be a possible way that we could square some of those circles. And I haven't heard anybody tell me that it's not, but maybe somebody here thinks, you know, can say why that's not really going to work.
So I read your position, John, as being, you know, quite a proponent of a process where, you know, the private sector should be able to form a proposal and test it through use of the DCO process. And I don't know if I've got that right, but maybe you could give a flavour of, you know, what you see as the sort of situation where where a DCO route might sort of assist, and that sort of goes into, you know, where do we see the threshold? Because I've seen some reports where people are saying, well, 1,000 homes or more, which seems far too low to me. I mean, I've always seen if NSHIPs are applying to resi-led sort of development, I see the threshold is much higher, sort of 10,000 homes, maybe more. But, you know, where do you see it, John?
Okay, thank you. And just to respond to live chat at the same time, I've been asked on a text why I'm in the Lake District. And just to explain that my bookcase isn't as impressive as Michael's. I knew that beforehand.
You don't live in a small lending library.
Yeah. Thank you. But Bridget, I don't disagree with you. There's clearly an important role for new town corporations, for development corporations. And we need a number of channels through which to deliver housing if we're going to get close to the target. But the thing which I think is important is the question is, why is the private sector denied access to the most powerful delivery tool available in planning, which is the DCO? And it's a tool which is available to lots of other forms of development, and not just basic infrastructure, but to business and commercial development, to strategic rail freight interchanges. Why not housing? And I agree it needs to be carefully controlled, and there needs to be a policy framework around it. But it seemed to me, and I noted down for myself, 3 principal areas in which I thought it would be helpful to consider the use of DCOs. And what I'm imagining is that you don't just make it available to anybody who wants to promote it, but the Secretary of State has the ability, as the Secretary of State does with business and commercial development, to say, yes, you can make an application. You need to go through a kind of gateway to be an appropriate applicant or have an appropriate proposal to go through the process. But the first of those would be, and perhaps surprisingly, where a local authority agrees. So this isn't necessarily a kind of us and them, and this isn't contrary to the plan or contrary to the local authority. So in the situation in North Essex, or certainly in situations where we are, the local plan process is struggling to meet the deliverability test. I wouldn't want local authorities to give up on that. I think North Essex got 1 new settlement through. New settlements do get through local plans, but it requires a lot of public sector commitment to make that happen, to help show the deliverability test. But how much easier it would be for a local authority to allocate land with confidence if they knew that the developer on allocation would have DCO powers to deliver the scheme. Why should it just be the public sector that has to take responsibility for land assembly or infrastructure provision? Why not give that tool to the private sector? So I think there's a real role for circumstance in which the local authority would want the developer to have that power to bring forward, to use their expertise, Gordon's expertise, to bring forward their expertise to enable that development to come through if it's consistent with the plan. So that's a first circumstance. A second is where there's a plan failure. And there are unfortunately significant parts of the country with well-documented unmet housing need. And that housing need is not being addressed because of politically reluctant local authorities. And we all know the parts of the country where this is true, but local plans default to short-term plans. They don't plan on a large scale. The duty to cooperate doesn't really work. People aren't picking up housing need. And if it's going to be picked up, you really need to give the private sector the opportunity to say, this isn't working. I want to make an application to bring forward a proposal. I'm perfectly happy to be tested against all relevant planning policy. But otherwise, the private sector is left to sit on their hands and wait for Homes England or somebody else to take national responsibility for delivering all of the unmet housing needs. The private sector should have that opportunity. And the third category are particularly complex schemes, so schemes which require the combination of infrastructure and planning to be consented at the same time, or with complex land ownership issues. Ironically, the deliverability test is most easily met if you're, say, an estate that happens to own a large area of land, but planning shouldn't be allocating any land based on land ownership. And the fact that you don't have land ownership shouldn't be a reason for not having you allocated or able to bring forward what may be the best sustainable proposal. So if DCO powers are helping you doing that as well, or the scale and complexity of a project could justify the use of DCO powers as not just new settlements, but Battersea Power Station, for instance. How cool that would have been for Gordon to be able to consent a Northern Line extension and Battersea Power Station at the same time in a single consenting process. So I think there are specific circumstances. It won't work in every case. It's not necessary in every case, but at the moment there's a very significant tool missing from the toolbox. And in terms of size, Simon, you know, we'll all have a view. I scribbled down 5,000 homes. Anything smaller is probably safer to deliver. But if you have a system like business and commercial development, the Secretary of State could consider particularly large or particularly small proposals and say, yes, there's a case for using this tool in this case, as long as you meet these specific requirements. We'll come on to talk about those requirements, I'm sure, but I'm imagining any system would have a policy statement around it, which would explain, if you like, the performance specification. You know, why should a developer be trusted with this power? Because they'll have to meet these policy requirements of design quality, affordable housing, infrastructure provision. And in terms of land value, giving CPO powers to the promoter effectively, together with the right policy framework, effectively captures the land value, because it requires that land value to meet the policy requirements, to provide the affordable housing, to provide the infrastructure. If you can buy land compulsorily or through acquisition at existing use value in a no scheme world, then you can afford to provide your new settlement or your urban regeneration project with its infrastructure. The difficulty at the moment is land value speculation puts up house prices, put land prices so far that once a developer has secured that option in competition with others, there is no money left for social infrastructure, design quality or affordable housing. And the DCO would be a tool that would break that, that problem.
And do we think, just reflecting on a question that's come in that was something I was going to ask, which is, do we really think that there is going to be investor appetite for this, given, you know, the experience of business and commercial NSHIPs has not been a good one yet, in that I think we've got two projects which have been at the sort of pre-app stage for a long time, and certainly not a stampede, to use the process. Is there something different about what we're talking about?
There is something different, and we certainly have clients who would want to use this process if it was available. But again, it would be an old argument not to have the process because we don't think anybody would want to use it. That's not a reason not to have the process. And I think the difference with business and commercial developments is, A, the demand for them is not as great. We know that the greatest national need is for housing, but it doesn't have this delivery tool. But also business and commercial developments tend to be more accepted locally by local authorities. Somebody comes forward with a major business and commercial scheme. Normally it's welcomed into the planning process and authorities will fall over themselves to fund it and help that happen. There is more resistance to large-scale housing-led proposals, and that's where one of the circumstances in which the delivery tool is needed.
Okay. I think that there is a question about the finance and funding, though. If one of the reasons for this is that there is that infrastructure element, it's not just about the provision of the housing, it's what the infrastructure is that has to go alongside it. And Gordon's experience in Battersea, and I was also involved in Battersea, I did the Transport Works Act order for the Northern Line extension there. One of that would not have happened had there not been the ability to have the partnership with a public sector funding entity. And to link it back into the rest of the network. So I think that I think that you'd still have to, somewhere in that policy, John, I think we're going to have something around how you can corral, if you like, the utility providers of whatever form, whether that's transport systems or electricity or water or flood, how are you going to corral those into the ability to do this? And I think that we're going to need to consider how the regulated industries themselves operate and the way in which they make their decisions and the way that they are regulated. And we've done some work on that at the NIC, looking at regulation and some of the lumpiness and their inability to respond forward, because they're only supposed to respond in the rearview mirror and not looking forward. So there's some other aspects of this. And that's where I still think, I'm not sure that the DCO is the right route for that, rather than say a development corporation with more of an envelope around it for that purpose. I'm prepared. And it's not saying I'm against the housing led DCOs. I'm certainly not. I'm not sure they're going to answer all of the problem.
I think just picking up on that from sorry, John, from our experience, getting the utilities involved is crucial, because our delivery method has sort of worked, but it's been all sort of different pieces. And one of the pieces that was left off, so to speak, was power. In that at one point we knew in, I think, 2014 that in 2017 the area was going to run out of power, and so there needed to be, you know, a sort of a quick discussion with UKPN as to how to retrofit that in, and so I think that definitely needs to be part of the discussion. But just picking up on a couple of points that have come through from John's comments, the delivery test and need point, and having all that in the local plan, I think definitely what there needs to be is a willing private sector body that wants to take that on. You can have all the need and all the delivery tests and all that, you know, perfect plan, but it does need someone who's willing to take on the risk to go ahead and deliver that, and hopefully make a profit from that. I think that definitely needs to be part of it. And certainly with our project, our shareholders, bear in mind, the power station is obviously quite unique. It has a very long history of attempts at redevelopment, but our shareholders had the certainty of buying the site that had the outline planning permission there, ready to go, which had a huge value, because they could hit the ground running. And on the point of the Northern Line extension, absolutely, there was there are so many different agreements between us and TfL, and our planning permission went first, but then the TWAO came in at the same time we were doing an amendment, and there was a lot of anxiety over that, because we're also having to do private legal agreements between us in terms of the land and funding and all those sorts of things. And then there was what was called the dual key, in that they wouldn't start until we started, and we wouldn't start until they started, because we needed the Northern Line to be able to build all our office space, but they needed all that office space because the business rates were being used to repay the loan. So we got there in the end. But you're right, John, if that was being able to be done in one application, in one process, it would have made things a lot easier.
Yeah, there's an inherent complexity that you need to gather together, everyone move in the same direction.
Yeah. Can I just say, Simon, just 2 points in response to Bridget. I think Michael, I'm sure, will have a view about this as well. But in terms of funding, there's absolutely no reason not to do a funding deal and even jointly make a DCO application with a government funding partner if that's the right thing to do, but still private sector led. But what I was principally going to say is that we mustn't underestimate the power of the DCO instrument. So the problem you're describing of connecting with infrastructure, dealing with statutory undertakers, those sorts of things, those problems exist in all sorts of DCO applications, and the DCO process has found a way to deal with those within a timetabled way as well. So it does require statutory undertakers to respond within time, and if they don't, the DCO gives you the opportunity to take those powers and do those works yourself. Michael, you've got experience with this, I know.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with that, and you know, I'm not sure that I have a huge amount to add, other than to say, obviously, the DCO is a sort of fantastically powerful vehicle for delivering things. And one of the things I hope we're going to explore, Simon, in a bit is the relationship between, you know, the things that Bridget's talking about, development corporations, and some of the sort of need and locational aspects of strategic housing, and how those sort of things fit with DCOs.
Yeah, no, exactly. Because what I wanted to, put to Kathryn is really my idea of how this might work, which is, you know, you've got a local authority with a housing need, a new settlement proposal that has its complexities. You know, wouldn't it be great if that authority, in working up its local plan, could take the soundness of that proposal as read, if an NSIP proposal for that new settlement had been the subject of a Section 35 direction from the Secretary of State, so that the local plan inspector could say, well, you know, my job is not to go into the deliverability and appropriateness of the new settlement. That's for that process. If that process falls over or is delayed by a certain period, then, you know, there will need to be an early review of the plan. But for the purposes of plan making, let's not have the whole of plan making just focused on the question of whether the new settlement is delivered. But Kathryn, is that oversimplistic, and how do we grapple with the question of like establishing need in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, this is, you know, we obviously sort of went on to all the delivery mechanisms, etc. But in reality, you sort of, before you get there, you've got to put the framework in place for actually how these sites are going to start to come forward in the first place. And that would be, you know, my concern as a non-DCO expert, so I'll leave that up to my colleagues. But you know, EIPs, local plan examinations, they are dominated by the question of need and spatial distribution. And you deal with need at a local level, you deal with it, you know, at an HMA level. But then how do you go, you know, is the MPPF and the local plan process really sort of geared up to deal with true cross-boundary? Are you going beyond HMAs and looking at a more spatial approach? You know, I'm not sure it is, to be honest. And I think the problem you've got is that, you know, that's the framework under which currently you have to look at bringing sites forward. And I think you probably, from my perspective, I think you need to look at taking the need for large scale developments. And again, you know, we've talked about the threshold. I'd say, you know, 5,000 minimum, possibly 10. But you need to look at a way of taking that part of it, I think, sort of outside of the local plan process. Because otherwise, I'm not sure. Otherwise, you're going to be potentially planning by administrative boundary rather than actually planning on the basis of whether or not this is the right area for a new large scale development. But that brings its own problems, because you know, it brings the problems of consultation, engagement, you know, whether people feel that development is being imposed on them from a top down perspective, which is obviously what the government are trying to get away from in terms of housing. But it is interesting that, you know, I can tell people that a nuclear power station is going to go near them, but I can't tell them that a housing development is going to go near them. But I think there has to be a mechanism whereby these large scale, and I'm not talking about urban extensions as 2,000 or 3,000, because I think the system can deal with those. You know, we are talking about garden communities. They I think do need to have a way of effectively bypassing the local plan system, so that exactly that, we don't spend the entire local plan examination dealing with the need, dealing with whether this is the right location, and potentially derailing the system really. So, you know, whether you have a sort of, you know, an NSIP housing, whether you have a sort of national settlement strategy, but I do think there needs to be some kind of national level plan in place for how this is delivered.
So Michael, what do you think about the possibility of, you know, a housing, you know, national policy statement, or you know, and the extent to which, you know, such a statement could be or should be locationally specific?
I think this is absolutely one of the most important challenges if we're going to move this forward. It's absolutely clear that national policy statements are one of the absolutely fundamental parts of the 2008 Act system. Obviously, you can have development consent orders where there is no national policy statement, but they're such powerful tools. And NPSs do two and sometimes three things. The two things they always do is they set out need, and they set out development principles, assessment principles. And for something like energy or transport and things, need, you know, is very often a very national thing. It's not specific, but sometimes MPSs do a third thing, and that is they set out locational guidance on where development should be. So the nuclear MPS, EN6, the wastewater MPS in relation to the Thames Tideway Tunnel, and obviously the airport's MPS in relation to the Northwest Runway scheme. And that then brings me to the sort of issue I think that Kathryn's kind of touching on in a way is, can you have a locational specific national policy statement? And my view on that would be a real challenge. That would be a real mistake to have one national policy statement for the country that tried to identify in detail these sites would be an error. So if you don't have that, what do you end up with? If I'm asked by government, what does it look like? What do I think it looks like? Well, I think your MPS probably says some things about need on a national level and possibly on a regional level, but not on a site-specific level. It probably sets out, in fact, it would set out assessment principles relating to housing and matters of that sort. That leaves a lacuna, which is the locational matters, but it seems to me that that's filled by either things like Bridget's development corporations or local plans, or in some cases, perhaps Gordon's Battersea Power Station development being a different example, no locational criteria, just simply an obvious opportunity for development. And that, I think, would mean you had to rewrite the Act, Section 104, which says you have to be in accordance with the national policy statement. I think you would have a new section 104.3a for housing or housing-led development, which says you're in accordance with the national policy statement and, where relevant, any spatial strategy. And that spatial strategy as defined might relate to development corporation or local plan allocation or whatever. If you don't fall within that, it wouldn't be a requirement. You could still have Battersea Power Station, but I think you'd need something that worked like that, slightly sort of pluralistic, that you can opt into and you can fulfill the development corporation vision, or you can fulfill the local plan vision, but you don't absolutely have to.
Would that work for you, Bridget?
Michael, aren't you just adding another layer of complexity to local plan making here? And if there's, I'm not sure, I can't quite see what your national policy statement is actually going to achieve if it doesn't say we need X new settlements or whatever. So when we did the National Infrastructure Commission, when we did the work on Cambridge to Oxford, we identified a total number, and we identified then that different ways in which it could be fulfilled. And there have been suggestions that you could have a national policy statement for Cambridge to Oxford, so it's got a spatial dimension, which says we need to find the capacity to deliver X. I'm not clear that's really a good idea, because I think it takes up to, if you like, that's a parliamentary thing. It takes up to Whitehall, what actually ought to be dealt with, in my view, at least the semi-local level. And after all, people have come together to discuss exactly that, and indeed the infrastructure required around it. And so I'm just not clear. I'm clear we need a delivery mechanism, but I'm not clear what an additional policy mechanism, the policy of perfection, as Gordon, I like that too. I usually say the best is the enemy of the good, but it's exactly that point. I worry that if you try and then develop something like a policy statement to cover all of this, by the time all of the civil service and the law and all you lawyers have put all the bells and whistles around it to deal with all these cases that might or might not exist, I don't know, it feels like a sledgehammer to crack what is admittedly quite a hard nut, but I'm not sure it's a very good enough sledgehammer.
I think, Bridget, we're actually sort of violently agreeing. What I'm saying is that I can see a role for a national policy statement to set out, as I say, broad strategy on housing, but not on an absolutely site-specific basis. I can see also a role for an MPS to set out a policy relating to housing. Now, it may do little more than copy the relevant parts of the MPPF. I mean, I'm not saying it has to be completely different. What I'm saying is, but what I'm saying is, I think on locational things, that's where I do think there is an important local role. And it may be North Essex, they want to identify some sites, and that therefore the developer, John's developer, coming forward with his DCO application can say, right, this site has been allocated, and my section 104.3a says, yes, you have to comply with the general policies for housing of strategic sites, but also you have to have regard to the fact that there is an allocation here. Yes, you are fulfilling that. You don't have to then separately prove location. That is established for you. Or alternatively, in your development corporation, yes, you say, I don't have to, in my DCO, separately prove location because I'm bringing forward my DCO in the development corporation area, in an area that has been locationally identified. And that's why I think it's a slightly more pluralistic system, that it's using the DCO, and one of the comments earlier was talking about this, it might have been one of Robbie Owen's, using it as a delivery mechanism to deliver some strategic housing that has been identified through other means. So that's kind of what I had in mind.
Can we just move to a different level, which is the neighbourhood level, the community, the people who already live in the area? I mean, planning for the future talks about accelerating planning decisions, but also talking about making it easier for communities to engage and play a role in decisions that affect them. I mean, Gordon or anyone, are these two mutually exclusive, or how can we do this, particularly when, you know, if these DCOs are going to be driven by the private sector, there's going to be a lot of suspicion.
My first thought when you were talking, Simon, was that they're actually a contradiction in you know, the government saying we want to speed this up and involve local people. And that's from the perspective whereby I could be wrong, but I think the majority is there is a default to NIMBYism. It's not me. I tend to write letters of support for things because I like to see things going up, but I think I am in the minority. So I think there is a tension. You can overcome it. We have at the power station, but again, it's a lot of hard work. We have a dedicated communities team who spend all their time in the community, and we do week-long public consultations, and it's effective. We tend not to get, you know, reams of objections.
But
so I think it's
sorry, Gordon. I think I'll push back on, you know, the reference to NIMBYism, because I think if, you know, anyone living in an area and faced with a proposal for 10,000 homes is going to be asking, well, what's the basis for this? You know, who decided it was a good idea?
Yeah.
You know, prove it to me. What influence can I have over that decision, and how can I buy into the details? So, you know, I'm really wary of.
Simon, I think that's a helpful way into what I think is the way to look at this, which is that what I'm suggesting is you give people the power to apply for a DCO. That's very different from saying we have a spatial strategy that sets out a blueprint for where all new towns are going to be, or garden towns. I think the lesson from eco towns is that people thought they were being imposed on them by government, and local communities didn't have a say in that. And I think the same problem would apply if you tried to come up with a kind of national spatial strategy, or even a regional spatial strategy for where these developments should be. What you would do in my world is the private sector would have the ability to make an application. Just because you make an application doesn't mean it's going to be approved. We know the DCO process involves rigorous consultation. And Michael, I think they could be decided against Section 105, which is just, the test is take into account anything that's important and relevant. So if you've got a good planning case, it'll be approved. If you haven't, you'll be found out, because the examination process is thorough and robust. So in my world, you don't actually need an NPS. And in fact, an NPS, I think, complicates the conversation more than it needs to. You don't really need new assessment principles, because we are meant to know what good planning is by having an NPPF. The government could have a policy statement if it wanted to, saying what the extra policy requirements would be for large-scale development, but they're only going to be things that we know already: affordable housing, good design, providing infrastructure, those sorts of things. So I think maybe the comfort, if anybody's needed, both from a community perspective and from a developer perspective, are the gateway principles. So if you go through a principle, you have to meet these kind of criteria that I've suggested. Is it consistent with the plan? Has the plan failed? Is it particularly complex? That's why you can make an application. But government isn't saying, because they allow you to make an application, that that's being imposed on a community. It's saying, you can now try your chance with an application, go through consultation, see if this is a good proposal because it fits in with local spatial strategies, or there's a particular need that hasn't so far been met.
But would you, John, as part of that, would you want the local spatial strategy to have a particular status? Because obviously at the moment, the local plan in the 2008 Act system doesn't really have any particular status. The only thing that has as policy a matter of status is the MPF. And you know, my 1043A was, look, we write in that spatial, anything spatial that does exist can have special status as well. It doesn't mean that you can't go under 105. So
yeah, I'm not sure it needs to be special status, but we know if there's an up-to-date local plan and you're applying under section 105 effectively because there's no NPS, then particular weight is likely to be attached to the local plan. So if you're going directly contrary to a bang up-to-date local plan that has met housing need, then you're a very brave or reckless developer. But if the local plan has failed or you're consistent with it, then other matters will be important and relevant, and they'll be taken into account in a balanced and properly examined decision.
So it becomes purely a delivery vehicle.
Yes.
If we stick on
the
the theme
about the DCO then is its ability to deliver the infrastructure part of this and not just some housing. And that's coming back to Simon's point about, you know, where there might be some borderline. I was thinking 5,000 actually, which is where people begin to say, and it comes back to the money point, that the infrastructure is bigger than you would normally expect to supply as part of a housing development. But 1,000 is too few, I agree.
So I just wanted to, you know, focus on some of the big issues that maybe we haven't yet spent much time on. One of them is, you know, the question of long-term delivery, phasing of schemes, the need for flexibility. I mean, John, do you think DCOs can deliver on that in the way, you know, more than say a traditional planning application or an LDO?
Yeah, I've heard this suggested as a reason not to have housing-led DCOs, but I don't personally understand it because we all know now how to create flexibility within an application. And it, in a sense, it's no different from making an outline planning application through the normal town and country planning process. You need to meet the requirements of environmental assessment. So we're used to using parameters and envelopes to achieve that flexibility. And you build as much flexibility as you want into your application, as long as you're prepared to assess it and have a proper mitigation strategy that meets that requirement. If through the long-term development you find you need to change, there is a change process. And I don't think people should be too afraid of that. Although there's probably a case, and I don't want to get these two things confused, but there's probably a case anyway for amending the DCO process to allow changes more easily than are allowed for any form of development. But I don't think there's any reason in principle to exclude housing from DCOs, because we know how to consent things of this scale in planning terms, and that part of the DCO is just a planning application.
Okay, next big issue is probably for Michael, which is strategic environmental assessment and EIA as well. I mean, I remember the Eco-Towns process. In fact, I was challenging on behalf of the BARD campaign, arguing that it was caught by strategic environmental assessment, and we had lots of abstract legal debate as to whether the proposals by the government did in fact set the framework for subsequent decision making. But I sort of sense that why the government has been a bit vague about, for example, Camcox, is that they do not want to be caught by something that requires SCA. I mean, do you think we can navigate our way through, you know, these issues, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, you know, clearly SEA and EIA, you know, applies in the system at the moment. You know, part of the challenge to the airport's MPS is on or was on the SEA ground. So I mean, clearly that exists. I think the the challenge is exactly the thing that, you know, John's been talking about, and you know, is something that I'm very interested in, is this whole concept of very long-term, long-scale development. You know, someone mentioned before, you know, generational, 30 years. How do you SEA, how do you EIA something where it's actually evolving over 30 years and you don't know now precisely what it's going to be? I mean, Gordon would, you know, recognize this. And I think one of the things that we've got to get kind of smarter about and better about in the system is the whole idea of monitoring and adaptive management of effects, so that you set up processes at the beginning of you know, the development consent process, which allow you to adapt over time. And John and I both worked on a project called the Silvertown Tunnel, a TfL project a few years ago, where we introduced for the first time ever a road a charging mechanism for the tunnel, which was variable. It could go up and down. And part of this, and you know, John might want to comment on this as well, but part of what we did, there was a sort of a code, a policy that had to be applied and overseen by the mayor. But one of the criteria for adjustment to the charge was things like air quality, environmental effects, because how do you know in 20 years' time whether all vehicles have gone electric or whether something else has emerged? And so there was a mechanism for recognizing that things would change in the future and then allowing, you know, adaptation to the mitigation. And I think we need to be better at that. And John, I know, you know, I know you're very interested in that, as indeed am I.
Just to say that I know that through kind of a thoughtful approach to mitigation like that, that helps to create flexibility within the application. But just to say, I think that's not a DCO problem, that's a planning problem. That would apply if we make an application for this large new development through the town and country planning process, or through the DCO process. And as you say, I think we're finding the tools to do that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think what the DCO gives you, though, is perhaps some greater mechanisms to produce a system that is adaptive into the future. Maybe that's for another day, but it's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, I'm conscious.
Years ago, I made an application for a flexible uses, even within the town and country planning, and that was for Ebbsfleet. So he said we'd have housing between this and this, and a hotel and leisure between that and that. So added that if you couldn't do the whole thing, but between it you could flex it. And I don't know why we don't do more of those.
Yeah,
Bridget, did you want to say something about sort of funding, and you know, whether you think this approach might unlock any new models for sort of funding these big schemes, and basically, and I suppose go. Yeah,
I suppose that the way that it could, there's two problems here actually. One is, for anything large with infrastructure requirement, you need some mechanism to get the funding in up front. And that was where, you know, Gordon was talking about this, you know, well, we can't start until you start, and you can't start until we start. And indeed, the housing permission was contingent upon the delivery of the Northern Line extension in Battersea. So who is going to provide that forward funding for infrastructure? I don't think any of the things that we've talked about here so far, nothing in planning will do that, actually. We need then to have the ways in which you can engage with the utilities, and indeed where their own funding comes from, because no developer will be able to provide the kind of money upfront which is able to do that. So I think we need to think much more imaginatively then about what the payback mechanisms are. So some public money would need to come forward in order to produce either the road or the railway, or possibly the electricity substation even. And then there's a mechanism by which you're going to pay that back. And I suppose what we've really got to think about is the complexities of Section 106 and whether that is actually fit for purpose. We were going to replace it with SIL, but we didn't. We just layered that on top. And so, as in so many other aspects of our planning system, we've created something which is just so complicated that nobody can understand it. in the Battersea case, as I'm sure Gordon can tell us more, the whole mechanism is about business rates. And so we had loads of calculation about what the likely business rate was going to come from. So it may be we still need to go back and think about the council tax system, because after all, one of the things that we've utterly failed to do, in spite of various attempts, and I tried to do this in London with the arguing about the rates system, is the mechanism by which rates are set for properties is just fixed, and it hasn't been updated since God knows when. And unless I think we can manage to do something about that, which is probably a topic for another day, I think we're going to still have some real problems on the funding front.
What I'm going to suggest now is we've got five minutes left. We've had so many questions on different subjects. I'm going to scroll down and quickly summarize some of the things that people have asked and commented on, and then give you all 30 seconds or so to just make any wrap up comments, really. We've had a question about what change of mindset do you think will be needed by the public sector to make this successful, complicated JV partnership arrangements going to be needed across numerous parties, resources. Someone pushing back, Michael, on your suggestion about locally specific NPSs being such a mistake, questioning that. Will the proposed Oxford-Cambridge Arc settlements ever be delivered bottom up? Would an NPS series of DCOs, Development Corporation help? Consultation, a lot of people are coming back to engagement with local communities. So there's more besides, but perhaps Gordon and Kathryn and Michael, John and Bridget, Gordon, any final comments?
Final comments, and then maybe throwing in a sort of controversial thought, but just from my perspective, it's having a system that focuses on the delivery and what we're all here to achieve, and makes that easier without having a detrimental impact on different parts of the process going through it, so public consultation, etc. Because these big projects are hard work, so having a fit for purpose process for these large projects, I think, is the ultimate goal. And then the last point was I'm on the planning committee for OPDC, Alder Park Rural Development Corporation, as an independent member. And a colleague on that committee said one day that his constituents were up in arms about a decision he'd made on the previous month. And I realised how lucky I was to be there on a purely objective point of view and not have to worry about the politics. So is there a role for independent decision making for planning?
That comes into the question of whether the Secretary of State should still make the ultimate decision on NSHIPs, which is for another day. But Kathryn.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for Simon. I think what I've heard from the discussion is that there's been a lot of debate about the DCO as a delivery mechanism, but what it still seems to have come back to is the framework by which you can get to a DCO. And from my perspective, it still seems to be that we've come back around to this position that there is still potentially a role for the local plan system in there, and that actually to be able to do the DCO or another option, I still need a local plan allocation in the first place, which is a bit tricky when actually, from my perspective, the local plan system isn't set up and the NPPF isn't geared towards delivering these sort of scale of schemes. So there is a question I think that has been raised. I saw it in the Q&A about the role of why we shouldn't have locationally specific policy statements in this respect, and I still come back round to the view that perhaps there is a role for that. I appreciate obviously Michael has a different view, but I've got to find a way as a strategic land planner. I've got to find a way of getting my site allocated and bringing my site forward before I can begin to look at the delivery vehicle as well. So I kind of need a framework upon which to bring the sites forward and get to the DCO process as well.
Thanks, Kathryn. Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of respond both to the original question and to Kathryn. I should make it clear, I'm not opposed to locationally specific housing NPSs as a matter of principle. I'm a pragmatist. You know, I try and deliver things for clients. My concern is that NPSs are nationally designated. And once you take those decisions away from local communities or development corporations or whatever, and you do them through that process, you risk a democratic deficit. And if you risk that with communities, you end up with challenges. Now, could you, for Camcox, for example, have an NPS or something else? Yes, of course, you could do that, and that would very much simplify things. But you know, my real sort of kind of purpose with this, if we're going to have residentially led DCOs, is they actually deliver something. We just don't get absolutely bogged down in litigation over nationally imposed policies on local communities. That's where I come from. I like to deliver stuff.
John.
Just make 2 or 3 short points. One relates to complexity. So the concern that this is going to make things more complex, I think, is the wrong concern. I think it's going to make it more straightforward for the promoter, because you would be assembling all the powers you need of delivery within your own hands as the applicant. And that would include, I mean, can extend, for instance, to include control over business rates in the area of your application. That was certainly contemplated in the NPS for the Northwest Runway. So, and road user charging, things that you need in order to generate funding for infrastructure can much more easily be done within a DCO envelope than they can trying to navigate your way through the planning process and then rely on lots of other delivery partners who you can't corral. So don't underestimate the power of a DCO. In terms of NPS, I said my piece, but I don't think that what we're suggesting here is imposing on communities the answer. We're suggesting giving applicants the opportunity to make an application which would then be very closely consulted and examined. And I think experience suggests that even with the most controversial DCOs, at the end of a process, the community does think that they've been satisfied, that they've had a fair hearing. It's a very, very good process. And Kathryn, just on the local plan, what I hope to be saying, there's 2 things. One, it could help you get your allocation through the local plan. If the local authority knows you could have DCO powers to deliver, they're going to be more likely to allocate and rely on you. But if the local plan process is failing, you don't need a local plan allocation. If there's a clear unmet need in an area, you could make a DCO application for your settlement. And at the moment, your client just doesn't have that opportunity.
Thanks, John. Bridget.
Okay, so I think that the process by which you might use a DCO is reasonably well established. It is something we've got out there. I don't see any reason not to use it, as you know, John's outlined many of the ways in which you could. I think that, however, Kathryn is also right that somehow we still need to get those allocations, and we need the plan making mechanism underneath it. I'm still slightly concerned that, you know, our system it's all very well for all of us who do all this stuff so much of the time, but at the moment we still have a planning system which is so clunky, so complicated. It's not accessible to ordinary people. Digital actually could help that. And so I think we still need to think about how these things are actually going to slot together more effectively. So I think it's been a useful conversation. I'm more convinced that DCOs are a part of the armory, if you like. But I'm also equally concerned that I don't want to see too many different things, too many different routes that people can use, because actually it just adds to complication, and it adds the potential for legal challenge as well.
What a fantastic note to end on. Well, thank you all for your contributions, and thanks to everyone sitting in your homes and possibly some of you in your offices for contributing. We've had so many good questions and comments. We've overrun slightly, but I hope people found that useful. And as I say, I hope I'll get round to you a recording of the event. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That was good.
Thank you.